Hey guys, so today we're going to be looking at the events that led up to the American Revolution, or the road to the American Revolution, if you will. So you should have a graphic organizer that looks a little bit like this. It's got kind of a million boxes on it. Just be aware, this graphic organizer is a little funky. It starts at the bottom, so we'll look at the bottom where it's got the Road to Revolution box. It follows this way, kind of curves up that way. If you look, there's like a little line between each one that should show you how to follow the path there. So a couple things just to be aware about this video before we get started. One, just because you are filling in the blanks as it is doesn't mean you shouldn't listen, because I'm still going to be saying some pretty important stuff. So make sure you are paying close attention, watching the whole thing. Also be aware that what you are supposed to put in the little box at the top up here, right, is the date and the name of the event. So that's what goes in that box. Today we're going to start with just kind of looking at how the American Revolution kind of built up over the years. So the way I kind of like to think about this period is like a road map, right? So if you think about going somewhere to get to a journey, you're taking a road to get there, right? So this is the road that we're taking, and you'll see how as we get to the end of it, things start to escalate more and more. So it starts actually way back when the colonies were baby colonies back in 1651, and British passes the Navigation Acts. So we talked about these a little bit already. So these are those laws. They're mercantilistic laws, which means that they're all about supporting Great Britain, right? And basically what these laws do is restrict the colonists' ability to trade with other nations, saying they can only trade with Great Britain. Now, as you can imagine, that might, make some colonists pretty angry. However, they're not going to be strictly enforced. This is that term salutary neglect that we talked about, or salutary neglect, where basically what it means is the British are kind of like not really paying much attention to them yet. That will change. So that's the first step. Then we go to 1763. We've ended the French and Indian War, signed the Treaty of Paris, and it's at this point where the British are kind of like, wait a minute, we have all these really valuable colonies on the other side of the ocean. Maybe we should do something with them, right? So it's kind of like that whole neglect period's over at this point. They're like remembering, okay, oh my God, we have these colonies. So French and Indian War ends. And just after the French and Indian War, due to some issues with the Native Americans in the East, or in the West, the British passed the Proclamation of 1763. This is going to be the first in a series of laws that just make the colonists really unhappy, where they forbid them to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists, of course, promptly ignore the law, and then that's going to lead to a lot of conflicts between the colonists and the natives in the West. But like I said, this is really just the first in a series of laws that are really just going to annoy the colonists pretty much. So 1764, the next year, the British are now trying to figure out how they're going to pay for this war they've just fought. Wars are super expensive, and they need to be able to raise money in some way to pay back all of the debt that they're in from this war. And like I said, they've just kind of remembered, hey, we've got these really wealthy colonies on the other side of the ocean, and hey, they're paying like a quarter of the taxes that everybody in England is paying. Maybe we should start taxing them. So the Sugar Act is an act specifically put on sugar, obviously, molasses, this sort of thing. And the idea is that it's going to pay for the cost of defense and the money spent on the French and Indian War. The colonists are a little perturbed by this. A lot of the colonial governments had already raised money to pay for their own French and Indian War debt. Virginia, for example, had put a tax on wagon wheels in order to raise Virginia's part of the French and Indian War debt. And so they're like, why do we need to pay this twice? Like, that's not cool. We don't really like that. So the Sugar Act is the first of these series of laws where the British are not happy, or the colonists are not happy with the taxes being put on them by the British. 1765, in March of that year, Parliament passes the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act is probably one of the more famous ones. And basically what the Stamp Act said is that all legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, everything have to have this special watermark on them. So this is where the term stamp comes from. They either had like a watermark in the back of the page that's like really light and like you can print over it, or you actually had to buy a stamp and put it on your document. And this was a little bit more expensive kind of paper. And a levy, just so you know, is a tax. Okay, so a levy is another word for tax. So the colonists are really upset about this. Think about, paper is something we use on a daily basis. It's something that you have to have, right? And so the colonists are like, wait a minute, you're taxing us on something that you know we're going to have to keep using, and you're making us put this extra money on it. And really what's frustrating the colonists is that they didn't have a say in it. Right? There is no colonist in the British Parliament that's saying, hey, maybe this is not going to be a great thing. So it starts to cause protests throughout the colonies, starting really just simply like boycotting buying this paper. But then eventually it's going to even turn violent, where they start harassing the tax collectors, start, trying to kick them out of town, sometimes even being violent against them. Some tax collectors are even killed, all because they're just trying to do their job and collect the Stamp Act. But again, that's something that was not very popular. In May of that year, 1765, the British passed Hoarding Act. So what this said is that, all right, we've got these troops, right, stationed in the colonies. They need somewhere to live. So rather than building barracks or whatever we're going to do, we're just going to move a lot of the officers and like the head honchos, we're just going to move them into the homes of the colonists. So this is something called quartering. So essentially just imagine that somebody like comes up, knocks on your door one day and says, hey, we've got 8 officers. They're going to move into the bottom floor of your house. What? Like, come again? Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. They would say, like, you can live upstairs, but the soldiers are going to take downstairs. You got to, like, stay out of our way because we're going to have official business and stuff going on. And this is your house, right? You're like, what? Do I get a say in this? No, of course you don't. So this is something that the colonists are not super excited about, as you could imagine. In May through October of the next year, escalations and protests of the Stamp Act continue to increase and getting a little bit more and more violent. So a couple things happen. First, in May, Virginia passes a document in which it says that it's going to refuse to comply with the Stamp Act. It's saying, we're not going to pay this tax. This is ridiculous. We've already paid for our cost of the war. We don't want to be involved in this. That's something that is so popular through some of the other colonies that in October, most of the colonies, not all of them, but most of the colonies send representatives to a Congress where basically you've got like 4 or 5 different people from the different colonial governments who get together and they organize this document where basically they say the Stamp Act is unconstitutional. And the reason it's unconstitutional is because we as British citizens did not have representation in the British Parliament that passed this act. So this is the first time we're really talking about this phrase, taxation without representation, or you are taxing us without anybody in Parliament who represents us, who votes the way I want you to vote. Right? So they're basically saying you're imposing these laws on us and we don't have a say in it. And that's not the way the English Bill of Rights was set up. That's not the way the British government is set up. We are being screwed over by the Parliament, essentially. Then, in March and June of 1765, the British passed 2 separate acts. In March, they passed the Declaratory Acts. Then they passed a series of acts called the Townshend Acts. So the Declaratory Act actually repealed the Stamp Act. The British government listened to the colonists. They listened to the Stamp Act Congress. They said, we hear you, right? We hear that you are upset about this. We repeal the Stamp Act. However, we want to make it very clear that we still have the right to tax you, right? We listen to you this time, but if we decide that we want to pass more taxes on you, we have the right to do that, okay? They're declaring the right to tax the colonists, the Declaratory Act. Then it passes immediately after that in June, the Townshend Acts. So remember how they're saying, yeah, we'll repeal this one, but if we decide to do this again, we have the right to do that. Well, they did it again. They passed the Townshend Acts, which put taxes on tea, glass, lead, paper, paint, all of these things, paper that the Stamp Act was on, paint, so if you wanted to paint your house, lead is used in muskets, in bullets. They also would use lead in building things, glass if you want windows in your house. Tea is a British thing, right? Like all British people drink tea, and they're putting a tax on that. So all of a sudden, the colonists are like, bang, they're hit with all of these taxes all at once, and they freak out, right? So as the years kind of progress, things are burning underneath the surface, right? There's nothing outright. They're protesting. They're writing letters to the British government. They're upset. They're yelling and arguing about how upset they are. But nothing really happens until March of 1770. So in early 1770, the British had sent troops to Boston because of all of the protests and unrest that was going on. So basically, Boston became an occupied city. There are British troops in Boston whose sole job is to keep them under control. So there's a group of soldiers who are standing outside the customs house in Boston. And it's, 6 o'clock at night or something, a crowd that's just come off of work. Maybe they've come from the shipyards or whatever. They don't like this, and so they go up and they just start harassing the soldiers, calling them names, calling them out, yelling at them, and one of the soldiers gets hit by a snowball, right? When he is hit, his musket apparently went off. We don't really know exactly what happened, but when his musket discharged, all of the other soldiers who were really in this high charge situation, they're getting yelled at. They don't know where that came from. Maybe somebody fired at them. They volley into the crowd, right? So they start shooting. It kills 5 civilians, including a guy named Crispus Attucks, who was an African American. He was a freed slave who was living in Massachusetts. And this sparks crazy amounts of protest and violence. Paul Revere draws a political cartoon calling it the Bloody Massacre. Now, personally, I don't necessarily always think of 5 people as a massacre, but they make it out to be like this terrible thing. The men were put on trial, and they were actually represented by John Adams, who was their lawyer. And John Adams defended them, saying that, they thought their lives were in danger. It was basically a self-defense plea. And they actually got off. John Adams was able to convince the people that this was a legitimate mistake. But the Boston Massacre is really the beginning of the end of the peaceful time. So just after that, in 1773, a few years later, Britain passes the Tea Act in May of 1773. So the Tea Act, unlike what you might have thought, is not actually a tax. It actually took a tax away, okay? So think about this. It takes a tax off of a tea, all right? Basically, the British have this company called the East India Company, and that's like their big corporation that's run by the government. And they take all of the taxes off of East India Company tea because that's going to make that tea cheaper. The idea is that if the company is able to sell that tea directly to the colonies, then those colonies are going to, or the company is going to be able to make a lot more money that way. Well, the colonists actually hate this because they see this as resentful. They see it as the British forcing the government, forcing themselves, forcing a product on them that they don't necessarily want to buy. So the Sons of Liberty in December get together, and basically this is kind of like a really weird situation where they're all like hanging out at a pub one night, and they all decide that, you know what? Let's protest this. There's a ship sitting in Boston Harbor that's got a whole bunch of tea in it, right? Let's go out and just cause a ruckus. So they dress themselves up as Native Americans, as Mohawk Native Americans. We've got people like Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, a lot of really big names. And they go out and board the ship. They take all of the crates of tea. There's over 400 crates of tea on the ship, and they just throw them all into Boston Harbor. It was approximately 9,000 pounds worth of tea. In today's money, it's a little over $1 million. So the East India Company lost $1 million worth of tea in this instance. Britain was furious. They freaked out. And immediately, they passed a series of acts known as the Intolerable Acts. In Britain, they were called the Coercive Acts, okay? So think about those two names there. The Americans called them intolerable, this idea that we can't tolerate these acts. They are impossible to tolerate. Coercive, which is what the British called them, means that we are going to force you to do something. Like, they represent that this is a forceful act, right? So basically what they want to do is crack down on the state of Massachusetts. They see Massachusetts as the hotbed of this rebellion. They're the ones who are causing all this problems. It's where the Boston Massacre took place. It's where the Tea Party took place. It's where men like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams are from. And they're just like, screw Boston. We're cracking down. They take away Massachusetts self-government, so all of the colonial government that had been set up in Massachusetts, it's taken away. The army is installed as the temporary government. They cannot try their own court cases in Boston. They have to be shipped to Britain to try court cases. But probably the biggest thing that they do is shut down Boston Harbor. Boston is a shipping city. Without Boston Harbor, the merchants of Boston and the people of Boston are going to suffer. Right? That's where their money's coming from. So this is terrible for the people of Boston. The colonists respond to this by boycotting British goods. They're basically like, screw you. We're not buying any of your goods anymore. We're going to smuggle in goods from the Netherlands and from France and other places, and we're going to buy these illegal goods rather than buying your nasty stuff. So if you've ever heard about like the boycott of tea, this is pretty much why Americans don't drink tea every day. Right? Because tea was one of those things that was a British good, and we were like, we don't want it. They started drinking coffee and hot chocolate rather than drinking tea. And so this is why Americans don't have tea time every day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because we got rid of that with the Intolerable Acts. Also in 1774, the first Continental Congress met. So the Continental Congress was kind of like the Stamp Act Congress, where representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies, I think Rhode Island didn't send anybody, but representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies get together because they want to write a letter to the king basically to say, we don't like these intolerable acts. You're taking away our rights as British citizens by doing this. So they actually attempt to appeal to King George very peacefully. They write him what's called the Olive Branch Petition. And the idea is like, dude, we're sorry. We won't do it anymore. I promise, like, we're done. But the king basically is like, no. You've passed that breaking point. There's no way to get around it at this point. So this is kind of the final thing. The Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, that's the final thing. And officially, this ends in 1775 when British sends their men to Lexington and Concord to wipe out all of the armor, to clean out the armory where the people of Massachusetts kept their weapons and their gunpowder and that sort of thing. So the British send troops to Lexington and Concord. The colonists find out about it. There are a couple skirmishes there, and that is the first battle of the American Revolution. It has officially begun. All right? God bless America. So we'll get more into looking at specifically some of this more next week. Hope you enjoyed that. I will see you later. Goodbye.